Hi, everyone. I'm Natalia, Director of Product at Cerebras Systems. At Cerebras, we are building a new class of hardware dedicated to accelerate training of deep neural networks. And because that hardware is really good at training very large models, we also talk to and work with many customers who are using natural language processing for different applications in healthcare. So today I will talk a little bit about who Cerebras are and why we are at the Healthcare NLP Summit. I will share with you some of our observations about use cases we see in healthcare where large language models are used. Also talk a little bit about what can be done to train those very large models faster. And at the end, we'll go through a couple of case studies and share with you some of the interesting observations as we went through some of those training runs with our customers. So let's dive in. Cerebras Systems, for those of you who don't know, is a startup. It's a company which is building a new class of a computer system. We founded in 2016, and our purpose and our mission is to design the hardware specifically to accelerate training of deep neural networks. So we have an extraordinary team of 400 engineers with all kinds of backgrounds. We have hardware engineers, ML researchers, and all working towards the same goal. We have offices in multiple locations, and we are working with the customers across the world. So let's talk a little bit about natural language processing models. Probably you've seen these or similar slides before. So we all know that in the past few years, those state-of-the-art language models have increased in size by 3 orders of magnitude. So those models are really powerful, but they are really large and really hard to train. So it takes very long time to train these models, and typically people use multiple devices, multiple accelerators to train those models in even somewhat reasonable time. So even smallest versions of those models, like BERT base and BERT large, they typically trained on more than a single device if you use traditional hardware. So what it means is that, again, in order to train these models, you always need distributed training. But distributed training provides diminishing returns as you start scaling your infrastructure to larger and larger sizes. So on this plot, I'm showing the data from the latest MLPerf runs on BERT, MLPerf 1.1, which clearly shows that as you increase number of systems, as you increase number of devices to tackle the same problem, to run a single training run, then you get diminishing returns. So by increasing your infrastructure size by 440 times, you get acceleration only of 88 times. So in addition to providing diminishing returns, those really large clusters are very hard to program, set up, and to deal with. And yes, engineers in NVIDIA, Google, Facebook, and others have expertise to be able to do so. But what we find that many domain experts and many customers who don't have that extensive expertise how to distribute training across such large scale devices, they just it's really hard for them. It's not their area of expertise. So at Cerebras, we've decided, we look at that and we've decided that we will try to build a much larger chip. So we want, instead of scaling out the infrastructure, at Cerebras, we've decided to take a different path. We decided that we will try to build the chip as large as possible. So we have as much of compute as possible in a single device, and we can reduce the point where you need to go into distributed setting. So we built a very huge chip of a size of a whole wafer. We call it wafer scale engine. That's the largest processor, that's the largest chip ever built. And in addition to scale, in addition to size, in addition to being able to pack a lot of compute cores on a single chip, there is also one differentiation. We also made a very conscious choice about the ratio between memory and compute. So we've decided that we would like to optimize that chip for sparse computations, for computations on sparse tensors. So that chip has 40 gigabytes of on-chip memory that is kind of all cache. And all that memory, because it's on chip, has very high memory bandwidth. What it means for practitioner and for ML researcher, that means that we can afford to train models at smaller batches and still see very high utilization on the chip. We can also very efficiently work with the different sparsity methods, which also can lead to acceleration of the training. So again, two kind of main advantages: scale. You have a cluster scale compute in a single chip with the ease of use of a single device. And the chip is optimized for sparse linear algebra. It can do vector-vector operations at full utilization. So this wafer scale engine is a heart of Cerebras CS2 system, which is of a size of a mini fridge and can be deployed in a rack. And we use these systems to run a lot of experiments with different models and run many experiments with the natural language processing models. So because those natural language processing models are quite popular in healthcare and life sciences, we work closely with many partners and customers, and we observe firsthand, have a front seat to see how people are using these models. And I'd like to share that with you. So all of the use case probably can be divided into two broad categories. The first category is when people dealing with the text data. So it's still natural language, but it's a natural language in a specific domain, in biomedical domain. So people train those large-scale natural language models on domain-specific data sets, so such as PubMed abstracts or PubMed Central Full Text, some clinical records, many of them using their private data sets with clinical records, or even social media when users of just usual people tweet about some conditions or some drugs, and pharma companies try to take into account that information. So once that model is trained on that domain-specific data, there is a wide variety of downstream tasks which can be done on top of that pre-trained model. So the most popular ones which we see are name entity recognition. So people try to extract information such as drug names or chemicals, diseases, symptoms, some relations between them. So that's probably one of the most common use case on natural text and biomedical domains. There are many use cases on which are based on top of or built on top of classification task. So for example, people try to predict mortality based on some clinical records or probability of readmission in the hospital. So there is a lot of classification use cases which can be done once you have this domain-specific natural language model trained. Many companies build their own question answering and search engines to provide a tool to their researchers to stay on top of the game and to be to learn what's going on with the outside research, and also to be able to quickly navigate in a vast collection of text data and clinical reports which they have within the companies. So that's another also very popular use case. Also, data about studies can be in different languages. So machine translation and specific machine translation in biomedical domain is another interesting use case. So all of them can be done when you train those large-scale natural language models on domain-specific data. Another class of use cases, in my mind, even more interesting, is then when those natural language models, those transformer models, are used with a non-textual data. So people, you can think about many biological sequences. This is also sequential data. So things like DNA sequences, RNA sequences, or proteins represented as sequences of amino acids. They all can be used as a training data to train models and to learn representations for that for the data. And as in case with the language models, these models also later can be used for a wide variety of downstream tasks, which are specifically for life sciences. So a model trained on DNA sequences can be used later to identify specific regions in DNA, which correspond to promoters or transcription factor binding sites, which later can help understand how different genes are being expressed in different cells and tissues. So there is a lot of research going on in that domain, and in the future, probably that will help us to understand better some of the reasons or causes of the diseases, or some of the connections between DNAs and properties of our organs and tissues. These also models used to represent and to train representations on different types of proteins. So antibodies is also very popular kind of domain of study with these models. And as for downstream tasks, you can use, for example, you can train a classification model, which will try to also predict which position in a specific antibody relates to the paratope region, which is really important to understand how that antibody will bind to viruses and other instances. So there is a wide variety of those downstream tasks, and all of them can be done efficiently if you have a really good domain-specific model pre-trained on the type of data which corresponds to that task. So all of those use cases use a wide variety of transformer models. And if we look at kind of academia, if we look at papers, there are a huge variety of the transformer variants. So this is a snapshot from one of their survey papers. You can see that the list is pretty long, and it doesn't, I think, have all of the models which are used out there. But when we look at their industry and what people try to use in industrial settings, so most of them rely on validated standard models such as BERT or Roberta. So there is less variation in the model, but there is other aspects that have a really great impact on the quality of those models. So there is a lot of interest in experimenting with the different data sets, with different vocabularies which are built on top of different data sets, how you pre-process the data, and how exactly you construct losses, also very important. People try experiment with different model sizes and try different regimes of training. So in the industry, we see that there is less variability in the model type, but there is still a very wide variety of experiments which you can run with these models. So this is all good, but these models takes really kind of long time to train, and they're also very hard to train. So what we see also in industry that many reluctant to go into virtues of distributed training across multiple systems. They typically use a single system. And even training on a single system which has multiple GPUs has its own challenges. So you need to find out how to distribute a model across GPUs. If your model is small enough, then yes, you can rely on data parallel training. But as soon as model becomes larger, you need to decide what's the best parallelization strategy. If we are distributing not only across the system, but across multiple systems, it becomes even more challenging. So which distribution mechanism to use, either distributed TensorFlow, PyTorch, or Horovod, or others, that's all difficult questions to answer. And in addition to that, even if you figured out how to set up your training job, there is still a lot of variability in parameters. So you often need to retune hyperparameters if you change your infrastructure size. You need to tune different learning rates with different batch sizes, and it's all very brittle, time-consuming, and hard to set up. And once you figure it out, that setup, it still takes days and then sometimes weeks to run a single training experiment. And for all of those kind of novel ideas, how the models can be used on top of different data, the key is really fast experimentation, because you want to be able to test as many ideas as possible and then derive to the best possible model. So all of those kind of challenges limit their ability to innovate and limit the ability to experiment really fast. So how can we address that, and how can we train those models faster, and how can we enable more hypotheses to be tested? I think there are two primarily avenues to acceleration. The first is accelerate development, so make it easier to start training job, or make it shorten the time which you need to choose the set of hyperparameters to make sure that your code works in your environment, and all the preparation work that is needed before you click run. And then obviously accelerate every training run, because as I mentioned, those can take days and even weeks. So on the accelerate development on the first item, accelerate the development speeds. On the first item, acceleration of the development process, we believe that scaling up can significantly simplify things. So you no longer confront it with all the difficulties of distributed programming, and you can afford not thinking about many things which are painful in distributed program. You don't need to think about how to distribute the model. You don't need to deal with the very careful tuning of what batch size is optimal for the specific setup, what learning rates I should use for the specific setup. If I change my infrastructure, let's say I run the first set of experiments on a smaller machine because I wasn't ready to run on a large scale out setup, that means that I need to tweak all the parameters before I moved into distributed runs. So it's all very challenging. And if you're scaling up, if you have an ability to use one single system, this all goes away. And the second is faster end-to-end training. So how you can accelerate every single experiment. So the first bullet there, if you scale up, that means that you, again, you don't have any longer any communication bottlenecks. So your infrastructure will be as efficient as possible. But on top of that, there are other very interesting aspects where you can take advantage of kind of this scale up or special purpose built infrastructure and accelerate your runs. So the first one, you now have a freedom to choose a batch size which is optimal for convergence, but not hardware utilization. So on this plot, I share data again from MLPer from several different models, and I think the trends will be similar for other models. The plot shows how increase and relative increase in the batch size impacts number of samples that the model should see in order to get the target accuracy. So you can think about that if you train, for example, with a single system or a single GPU, and you use a batch size of X, then it takes you a certain amount of samples to get to the target accuracy. But then as you start to scale out to increase number of devices that you use for training, and if you use data parallel training, you are forced to increase the batch size in order to keep your hardware utilized. So as you kind of increase your batch size 15 times, I mean that you train on 15 as much devices as you started, you see that across all of the models, that means that you need to train for longer, for more iterations, or essentially you need the model to see more samples. And that speaks to kind of some of statistical inefficiencies of training with very large batch sizes. If you choose a hardware which can be utilized at a smaller batch size and still all of the compute resources can be utilized, then you don't have that problem any longer. And you can choose the optimal batch size and don't do this kind of wasted work on additional samples. Another idea is you can also accelerate by not processing padded tokens. So when we are talking about these sequence models, they all operate on sequences. And in order to make it easy for our hardware to deal with that, for any traditional hardware to deal with that, we pack those sequences into batches, and we want every single sequence in a batch to be of the same length. So what it means that independently of kind of how many words or tokens you have in a sequence, you will pad that till the maximum sequence length in your batch. And it turns out that amount of those pads is quite significant, even in language data, and even more so when you train models for things like proteins, because the proteins have very variable sequence lengths. So here, for example, I have analyses on PubMed data sets for data preprocessed to be trained with a maximum sequence length of 128 and 512. So the plot shows the distribution of sequence lengths across the quite significant subset of the data. So you can see that if for a maximum sequence length 128, there is quite large number of sequences which are close to that maximum sequence length, although there are still sequences which are much shorter than that. Then when it comes to 512, there are very few sequences which are of this maximum sequence length, and the majority of them are shorter. And what that means is that there will be a lot of pads in the data, and with traditional kind of computation, you will process those pads, so you will waste your compute. So that's another avenue of potential acceleration to do not process those pads. And the last one I want to mention is faster end-to-end training. And the last one I want to mention is leveraging sparsity. So there is a lot of research going on how to induce sparsity into weights of the models, or how to deal with activation sparsity, and take advantage of this kind of algorithmic reduction of cost to train those models and translate that to speed. So research shows that there is quite significant opportunity to speed up training. But in order to kind of realize that opportunity, you need the hardware which is capable to translate this algorithmic reduction flop count into faster time to train. And special purpose hardware can do that for you. So we talked at the high level what can be done, and now I want to go through some specific case studies and show you where some of those acceleration techniques have been realized, and some of the observations that we've made while training those large NLP models. So the first case study is probably vanilla one. We've been tasked to train a BERT style model on domain-specific language data on PubMed. So originally the goal was to replicate a paper published by Microsoft a couple of years ago, where they were the first ones to train the domain-specific language data. So the paper reported that it took researchers a couple of weeks to train that model on a DJX2 system. And because the experimental cycle was so long, they didn't do many experiments with different vocabularies, and they didn't report any results on larger variants of the model. So in this case, we set out to first replicate what has been done by the team. So make sure that we can actually reach the same scores on downstream tasks as published, and then do a little bit of experimentation with vocabularies, see how that impacts the training, try to increase the size of the model, play with specification, and essentially see how that impacts the results. So overall, in terms of speed up of experimentation with our CS2 system, we were able to complete those training runs significantly faster than reported by Microsoft. So for example, BERT-based model, we can train it on a single CS2 system roughly 8 times faster than what Microsoft observed on DJX2. And also, it took us a reasonable amount of time to train larger models. And that means that we were able to iterate and experiment with different settings. So those speedups are 8x speedup is just a comparison of wall clock training time. But we also would like you to keep in mind that if you would like to achieve the same training time in a distributed setup, it's unlikely that you will need just a DJ access to be able to train at the same time. So as I've showed before, the distributed training is heavily sublinear, so you will need a much larger number of systems, and it will be much harder to program to be able to train at the same time. So now let's look at some interesting things. So what some of the interesting findings from those runs? So first, we were able to confirm that essentially pre-training from scratch on domain-specific data is much better. So on this table, I show evaluation metrics for the first phase of pre-training, standard metrics, next sentence prediction accuracy, marked language model accuracy, perplexity of the model, when the model has been trained on PubMed data from scratch, and when we took already pre-trained model on a generic data set. So it's a standard BERT already pre-trained by on other data set, and we run evaluation on PubMed data. So you can see that the difference in scores is really significant. So here, I'd like to mention that no additional pre-training or fine-tuning has been done on this generic model. So that's if you take out of the box the generic model and you try to see how it fits domain-specific data. So you can see that the difference is very large. So we've also experimented with a kind of continuous pre-training and tried to see if we can bring that generic model to become more knowledgeable about medical domain, but in any case, the results were significantly lower than when you pre-trained that model from scratch. The next interesting factor is that we were able to compare performance on larger models and smaller models, large and base, on several downstream tasks. And we found that if the downstream task is complex, so things like question answering, so we used BioAsk, fine-tuning on the BioAsk factoid question answering. So we can see increase in performance when we go from smaller models such as BERT-based to BERT-large. But for some other tasks which are simpler, such as name names recognition, increasing the size of the model actually didn't matter. So the scores are more or less the same. So here we were able, again, thanks to this fast experimentation, to see what kind of advantage larger model can bring. And we see the value of larger model for more complex tasks. The next interesting finding actually confirms also the plots which I've showed before on MLPerf, how many samples kind of you need to get to the final accuracy if you increase your batch size. But here we see the actual impact. So here we tried runs with their smaller and larger batches and measured their performance of the model eval scores after the same number of samples seen. And you can see that when you train with a larger batch, the scores are constantly lower. So that means that essentially you have a faster conversions if you use more optimal batch size. The next also interesting finding, we were experimenting with the capability of our hardware and software to do not process those pads in the sequences. So we've been able to observe 1.1 speed up when we are training with the maximum sequence length on 128 and 1.6 speed up, 1.6 speed up when we are training with maximum sequence length 512. And that corresponds very well to the distribution of those actual sequence lengths in the data set, as you can see. So we know that we can take advantage of that. And here the speed ups are moderate because, again, the variability in the sequence length of the text data, it is there, but it's not as drastic as for some other use cases. When we train those natural language models on protein data, in some cases, we've seen speed ups up to 4x. And the last one on this use case, we also experimented a little bit with inducing sparsity. So we've run experiments when we induce sparsity into activations during the pre-training. And we induced moderate sparsity to do not disturb model at all. Yes, we were able to accelerate the training. But what's interesting is that induction of that sparsity actually led to better accuracy on the downstream tasks. So that's, I also wanted to share that observation. You see in this table comparison of evaluation scores after pre-training and evaluation scores on fine-tuning on this question answering by ask task. So you can see that the sparse model with sparsification performs actually worse after pre-training. So the scores, evaluation scores, when you completed the pre-training worse, which I think consistent with some other observations in the literature. But when you take that pre-trained model with sparsity and you fine-tune that on a downstream task, we see actually better results. So it could be a sign that kind of sparsification leads to better generalization of the model. So it's less kind of overfitting to the pre-training data set and has a better starting point to be able to fine-tune to downstream tasks. So that's a very interesting finding. And we are also internally working with many more experiments with sparse training. So that actually hints that not only you can get acceleration from sparsity, but potentially you can also in some cases get a better generalized models. So these are some of the interesting findings which we've had when trained those large scale models on language data. And this kind of all applicable on not only language data. Recently, we've also done a joint study with the GSK, and they published a paper on that when they used language models trained on CS1 system, that's first generation of the system, on DNA and epigenomic data. So in this case, the task was slightly different. So they were looking for learning the very efficient representation for DNA, and also kind of take into account some of the epigenomic data, which will help them to better understand the gene regulation for different cell types. And before, it was kind of infeasible to train those models on very large data sets, which they had. And with the introduction of CS1 system, we were able to reduce the experimental cycle with introduction of CS1, we were able to reduce the training time, and it gave them an ability to iterate quickly on experiments. So that was a very interesting kind of study for us, and feel free to check the reference. So in conclusion, we see that natural language processing models can be used for a wide variety of applications in healthcare and life sciences. There are many ideas to test. People play with different vocabularies, with different data preprocessing techniques, with different model configurations. There is very large stream. There is a lot of different ideas to test. But testing those ideas is expensive because those NLP models are very hard to train and take long time to train. And we believe that special purpose hardware such as CS2 systems can be a really valuable tool in the hands of those researchers. So it makes it drastically easier to train these models. You can forget about distributed setup. You have a single device and you work with that as a single device. And in addition to that, there are other avenues to get accelerated training. So you don't need to worry anymore about communication bottlenecks, about challenges of distributed training. You have a freedom to choose an optimal batch size and actually optimize your training setup, make sure that it's really effective, so you don't show your model more training samples than needed to get to the target accuracy. You do not waste your compute on pads because, again, we have an ability to be really flexible and to do not process those padded tokens. And you have an ability to leverage sparsity, and that's also a huge area of the research. And we hope to demonstrate some other findings with sparsity later. Thank you.